Welcome back to Framing the Future, a symposium exploring the potential of Web3 technologies to solve big global challenges. We're on day 3 of our 4-day symposium, and it's so great to see many of you back again. For those of you who haven't joined us yet this week, by way of introduction, we are the Frontier Technologies Hub. We're funded by the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which will be called FCDO for today. We've been working together to explore the potential for frontier technologies to tackle global challenges. I'm Abby Freeman, co-founder of Brink and head of Futures on the Frontier Tech Hub. I'll be your host for today and for the symposium this week.
And I'm Lea Simpson, Abby's co-founder at Brink and innovation director at the Frontier Tech Hub. It's really good to see some of you back again today. Thanks so much for tuning in.
So we're on part 3 of our 4-part symposium now. I thought I would kick us off by recapping a little bit. In part 1, we framed the challenge. What are the big global challenges that we're facing, and how might Web3 technologies provide solutions given its specific attributes? We had a wide-ranging discussion, and we heard from Phase 3 about some of the ideas they crowdsourced from their Web3 community across science, finance, and more, which you can revisit in the report, which will be shared in the chat with you shortly. Yesterday, for part 2, we speculated about the future, and we asked, why is speculative design useful for solving global challenges? And part of the answer to that was how it helps us build mental models that take us out of our everyday linear thinking and into more expansive thinking. We asked, what might the future hold, and what are some alternative visions of the future? And we heard from the likes of the World Economic Forum and UN agencies, global agencies who are exploring Web3 for things like digital identity for all, carbon trading, farming, and many more besides. We heard from 8 speakers in our lightning talks, and Pluriversa shared their field notes from the future. They shared 3 of their 5 future scenarios, which you can also dig into with some brilliant visuals in the report. Today, we're heading back to the present. So we're going to be talking about what needs to happen now to ensure the positive future that we'd like to see, and what are the risks, opportunities, and ethical issues we should consider. Tomorrow, for our 4th and final session, we're going to be asking, what now? What needs more investigation and investment? And should we even be investing in Web3 at all in our organizations? If so, how? Tomorrow will include a keynote from Dame Wendy Hall, which we'll say a little bit more about at the end of today. So we're here streaming talks and panel discussions live on YouTube. Then towards the end of the session today, imagine if we were all together in the same place. We'd be grabbing our coats, maybe grabbing a coffee, having a bit of a chat with each other about what we've learned, what we've heard, what we agree with, what we disagree with. So to recreate a bit of that connection between all of us who've joined today, there'll be a Teams link where you can carry on the conversation at the end of the session today. Other than that, there are a few ways you can engage in the event. Comment here in the chat box. I can see a couple of you have already begun that. So hello from Berlin, hello from Barcelona. Great to see a couple of you familiar faces from earlier in the week. Please let us know where else you're tuning in from. It would be great to see where we've got people joining from today. Other ways you can engage, I mentioned the Teams call. Do make a note of your reflections and any unanswered questions that you have at the end of today's session and bring those along. You can also check out the reports from our research on the website, and the link has just been shared with you there in the chat. And throughout the session today, and especially the panel, you can live tweet using our hashtag, which is hashtag FTWeb3. You can see it there on screen. That's hashtag FTWeb3.
Great. Well, you know, we started the symposium about the future with a touch of nostalgia. Much of the hype and cynicism about Web3 was feeling familiar to those of us old enough to remember a time when that same optimism and, frankly, disdain was leveled at Web2. And this work has been sparked, I guess, by the idea of a counterfactual world, a world in which we'd stopped sometime in the early noughties to take stock of our ambitions for Web2 and understand our tools and their potential unintended consequences. So this week, as Abby's already just described, we've been asking, how can we use the benefit of that hindsight to make sure that we don't move fast and break things this time around? To do this, we've been time traveling together, looking at the characteristics of Web3 and how evidence of what's happening today might play out in the coming decades. Together, we've explored the challenges that we're likely to face tomorrow, with things like worsening climate crisis, the rise of authoritarian powers, and other megatrends as they intersect with these advancing technologies. If we believe in the promise of Web3 and start to build on the real-world case studies that we have encountered across the course of this week so far, we can see some use cases emerging. I'll just touch on a few examples from the papers that we've linked to today. So one of those things is the idea of governance without governments, and wondering whether Web3 has a uniquely, specifically good role to play in settings where the standard checks and balances are seen to either be corrupt or maybe just aren't there at all. We've also wondered in some of our work whether Web3 is actually at its most useful when it's also at its most boring. So could Web3 technologies make us better, faster, stronger at doing things like business behind the scenes than we're doing them today? So for this, we've got examples of, you know, house purchases or insurance payouts. And then perhaps a bit of more of a gnarly topic, and one that came out over the course of yesterday, is Web3 and its relationship specifically with identity and identity's various politics. Web3 replaces those centralized data repositories with more decentralized ones. So that would automatically change the face of data privacy and who owns what, right? Or maybe not so much. Anyway, amongst all of this tangible evidence and explorations, there's something that's emerging for me that's almost kind of between the lines that I'm really looking forward to exploring a bit more today. You could call it a kind of emotional resonance of Web3 services. And the sense, it's a kind of a feeling that people are just ready for alternative forms of ownership, collaboration, and decision-making. And maybe it's really that kind of mood, as I know that the team at Careful Industries refer to it as, that is more important than the technologies overall. Anyway, there's a lot there, and a lot of it is, of course, very, very hypothetical. Each of these possibilities contain consequences, some positive, some negative. So how do we make any sensible progress in amongst all of it? We heard from our colleagues at Phase 3 on day one that there is still a major diversity issue in Web3. How might we enroll different people, those who typically don't have a seat at tech's top tables, to play a part in how we're shaping the future? Well, Rachel Caldicott and Anna Williams from Careful Industries are here with us today, and they're going to start getting at some of the answers to those big questions. Really, their job today is to bring us back down to earth and offer some concrete recommendations about how we can and why we ought to move more carefully into the future. I'm really looking forward to hearing from them, and I'm sure that everyone in attendance is going to enjoy everything that they have to say. And after that, we have got both Anna and Rachel joined by Scott Smith from Changeist and Dr. Becky Faith from the Institute of Development Studies for a panel discussion. After the panel discussion, I'll wrap the session up and we'll head to Teams to continue the conversation, as Abby said at the top of the session. For now, it's over to Rachel and Anna to kick us off.
Sorry. Hello. Sorry, I was muted. Right, I will go straight into my slides if that is okay. And so we have been working over the last 6 months trying to sort of get a handle on what is happening now and try and understand what that might mean practically moving ahead for the big challenges that we're all thinking about and dealing with. And although there's a lot of tangible things here, as Lee was talking about, there's a lot we don't know, but that I think we can make a guess at. And really, the work that we have done has come out in kind of two very different ways. On the one hand, we're looking at what the implications are right now for the short term, how to do things differently, and whether or not Web 3 is able to help with that. But equally, what seems, as we'll talk about, maybe slightly more interesting to us is what these new ways of organising and being together mean longer term, and how maybe the technologies we're seeing now are signs and signals of something else that is happening. Because, you know, I don't think it is news to anyone that a lot of things in the world are changing at the moment, whether it is the climate emergency, whether we're thinking about the aftermath of the COVID, whether we're thinking about equality, whether that is financial, whether that's in terms of power, access to land. And I think through the work that we have done, we have seen that maybe while there's been lots of hype and speculating about the technologies in Web 3, the reason they're like hanging around and the reason they're interesting to loads of us is because they're a sign of other things. And I think the thing that we're taking away is that the things that people do are much more interesting and much more important than any of the technologies those turn into. And in the slides we'll be sharing over the next half an hour, I think what we're going to be doing is balancing, on the one hand, the imperative to do things now with the, I suppose, importance of not getting caught up in technical change just because it's happening. So, as I was saying, the context of everything changing all at once for many of us has been overwhelming. And through the research we have done, we have seen that maybe a lot of people are not looking to traditional organizations or institutions or possibly even governments for the answers to those problems. And that maybe on the one hand, although we hear lots about the kind of more flashy technical outcomes of Web 3, the thing that's happening under the bonnet is this is a signal that lots of us are looking for new ways of organizing, new ways of owning things, new ways of gathering. And that this is possibly a much more profound move to innovating than any of the tech. This is kind of a deep change in how we're thinking about how we relate to each other as individuals, as communities, as people with a planetary responsibility, not only a responsibility to ourselves. Hang on. And yet, when we talk about Web 3, a lot of the time we get hung up on all these individual bits of technology. We get hung up on what a thing is able to do or not do. The number of conversations I've had, even with like very experienced with very experienced technologists who say they find it hard to sort of join up all these different technical attributes with actually the emotive side of the three. And of course, it's hard to ignore for anyone who is following the crypto news. Last night, TX were bought out by Binance, which was a huge financial episode. You know, it's a big change because these were one of the most respected, trusted crypto platforms. But that actually, it seems to us that kind of hype, the instability there, is a completely different thing to what is happening in the way that people are starting to think about organizing. And as we think about what that means for Web 3 in the context of the services and in terms of changing how we actually make things happen in the world, there's a conflict there. Because on the one hand, the energy around these new technologies brings like a lot of opportunity to bring in different people, different resource, different ways of thinking about doing things. But on the other, it means we could be rolling out things that don't really work yet. It means we could be acting hastily and doing things because they seem zeitgeisty, interesting, but not really because they fit the problem. But we have seen overall that there's something really interesting to play out here, that actually we can take advantage of the momentum of this immediate energy to create the change and do and really to try and solve existing problems in different ways, while equally thinking much longer term. And in order to achieve that, what we're proposing is moving towards what we're calling an adaptive system of governance. And so it isn't only making rules, which is obviously one part of governance. It's about learning, measuring, understanding, and importantly, it's about doing things, trying them out, experimenting, while also observing and understanding the change that they're creating. So we are going to talk about 4 things that we think are really important as a way of working together to both make immediate progress and to kind of sit longer term, holding and understanding the problems and issues and the changes that these moves to other ways of organizing are likely to bring about. And I'm going to hand over to Anna, who can talk about some boxes and offer some context of why they're really important.
Hi, so yeah, as Rachel explained, through our research, we've been focusing in on understanding the hype around Web3 technologies, as well as possible applications for its future global challenges. And to do this, we conducted research into the attributes of Web3 technologies, which are commonly touted as the defining characteristics that might make Web3 technologies better than what went before, maybe. So we really spent time drilling down into what these attributes were, and during the research we uncovered a number of limitations and problems in the existing design of Web3 technologies. And these problems or challenges not only have the potential to slow down or stop innovation in the field, but they also they present potential risks. And the risks in rolling out these technologies mean that at best they're not fit for purpose, but at worst they could be exclusionary or extractive for certain communities. So we proposed sandboxes as a key recommendation in tackling global challenges. So really an opportunity to work through some of these challenges in an enclosed environment. So the solution is the sandbox, and in software testing environments, sandboxes can allow untested code or programs to be used in a closed environment. And they allow software developers to simulate a virtual computer and run and test software applications. And it allows us not to worry about the possible impact this might have on adjacent programs or networks or people. So sandboxing therefore protects people and their data and the systems that run them, and prevent any possible damage. So our research has uncovered a number of areas or challenges that could be addressed through sandboxes. The first issue to highlight is the cost of entry with Web3 is quite high. So actually incentivizing innovators through grants or prize money via sponsored sandboxes could potentially allow new innovation to emerge and maybe allow unusual suspects in terms of innovators to emerge. We also identified a number of other challenges that could be sandboxed, including validation protocols. So the idea of maybe perhaps moving even beyond proof of stake, interoperability, so incentivizing innovators to test systems that allow different blockchains to work together. And we also considered remittances as an area of possible exploration. And these are all areas of innovation that could benefit from maybe de-risking through possible sponsored sandboxes. And overall, the aim with sandboxes is accelerate towards a solution in a safe environment that doesn't impact on potentially vulnerable users, and is maybe providing funded for a potentially underfunded problem. And another ultimate aim is that out of these sandboxes, there will be data that's produced, and this could be used to understand the risks of deploying new Web3 technologies to tackle global challenges. So anticipating longer term challenges, we also conducted some research with our partner organizations to think about possible longer term implications of Web3 technologies and the ways they might be used in the future. So we did this through a range of speculative research and inputs. And from this, there were 4 key themes that really came out of this research. So the first was about resources and authoritarian power. And it really explored the possible rise of authoritarian values and power. There were certain technical aspects of Web3 technologies that could enable authoritarian powers to develop and thrive, possibly, as a way to mitigate this risk. So our research explored approaches that could ensure separation between Web3 communities and the state. And this separation in the future could be an opportunity to protect citizens from potentially corrupt governments in the future. So here we set out a scenario of the benefits blockchain, a system that might be deployed in good faith, but in the future could be used by governments with other intentions. And this example was really designed to highlight that a situation in which those in control of the technology experience transparency and flexibility, but those who actually use the technology for its reported intended purpose might experience an opaque or rigid form of that technology. The second theme we explored was the rise of non-geographical governance. So Web3 has the potential to enable new forms of governance and that might not be bounded by geographical borders or local jurisdictions as they are today. So decentralized decision-making systems could radically transform political participation at a local level and collaboration on a global level, potentially. So here we set out a scenario where DAOs and other Web3 technologies in global governance could be used to catalyze new frameworks and create new codes of ethics for policymakers, laws, and construct a framework for decision making, essentially. But this was caveated with a significant risk that if you automate things at that level, there's a potential of automating mistakes on a global level. And then the final theme was around climate change. So there were multiple scenarios identified through our research about the possible impacts on the environment and the adoption of Web3. So concerns were ranging from water and food insecurity to sustainability and environmental degradation. So we explored some ways in Web3 could automate aspects of land and resource management to the extent even of those resources, the resources themselves being given the agency to self-regulate. But this was definitely something we felt needed to be explored further, possibly in a sandbox. And the other theme was the tokenization of everything. And so this scenario essentially explored the ultimate expansion of tokenization to effectively reduce everything from playing online games to securing a mortgage into a speculative asset. And with the ownership of just about anything being represented by a token. And again, this highlighted the need for urgent sandboxing around forms of token economics and really understanding the advantages and risks with those new emerging forms of economics. So the question is how to create these changes in line with the digital public good standards. We felt that it was really important for our research and for any work going forward that there was, even the sandboxes, that there was a framing around impact. So what impact do you want to create? Not necessarily about profit, as many Web3 innovators look to, but around principles that define impact as social benefit, possibly. So that we can't stress enough that any future research should, including the design of the sandboxes, should be centered around the values set out in the digital public good standards. There are too many standards to mention here, but essentially the aim is to support the design of innovations that demonstrate clear safeguarding and inclusion of standards, and also closely consider the extent to which they're affecting or affected by the ecosystems that they're entering into, and they ensure they have long-term implementation plans. and this avoids projects that might be extractive or excessively top-down. So I will pass back to Rachel now, who will talk a bit more about standards and our final conclusions.
Yeah, and it might seem counterintuitive to think about how the standards interplay with decentralized the technologies, because of course, you know, if the idea is that everyone is able to have the transparency and shared governance, you'd imagine that meant that the standards were not really needed. However, one of the things that we found in thinking about how Web3 technologies are likely to be rolled out is that not everyone whose lives are changed by these technologies is always likely to be a stakeholder. And so, for instance, you know, if you're taking part in a food program where food is distributed to you through a centralized system, it's unlikely that you are going to have access to the system. You know, so there are ways in which actually sometimes the collaborative technologies do not always lead to transparency for everyone. More than that, there's another issue that came up around how it seems extremely likely that we will have nodes of communities collaborating between and across countries, and that actually the likelihood of there being conflicts here in terms of legal norms, cultural norms, the infrastructural needs to support those things is enormous. And there's an extent to which actually we are likely to see I think technical change happening ahead of the legal and regulatory norms catching up. And of course, we can never really kind of anticipate genuine legislative change through standards. However, it felt to us that there's a lot of work already happening, as Anna was saying, particularly around the digital public goods standard, that could be built on in order to start understanding the impact in place of any deployment of Web3. And that longer term, there's a real opportunity here, not only to be thinking in a classical top-down multilateral way, but to be moving towards genuinely power sharing models where governance is decentralized. And as I was saying, it feels a really good thing to do, to start where everyone is already talking to each other. There's a load of complexity that has been worked out and understood in terms of how technology can help communities to thrive on the ground, how to make it long-lasting, maintainable and manageable. However, this is unlikely to be the whole of the story. In thinking about these here are 9 of the indicators in the Digital Public Goods Charter, and so part of a much larger document. But I think one of the things we can see here is a lot of these are extremely broad, and that understanding the application of any Web3 technology in each of these categories and beyond is really important. So thinking about, as Anna was saying, access to compute power, access to skills, the importance of ensuring any technology can be managed in the long term, and that actually we feel it's likely that there are other things that are likely to come up here. And so thinking about transparency, privacy, access to personal information, how that is likely to be governed. It's a real opportunity to go back to these standards here and work over those again. But longer term, we are really keen to see different kinds of standards centered here too. The indigenous standard for data governance, which is here, is a genuinely participatory set of principles that have been created by practitioners and academics, really thinking about how power sharing can be at the heart of any use of data and technology. And we really highly recommend putting that at the heart of whatever happens longer term with Web3. And lastly, we would like to talk about understanding of patterns. And I think, you know, there's been a lot has happened in a short amount of time in the rollout of Web3 over the last 6 or 7 years. And that really those things are going to look really different in different contexts. And we would really like to see very, you know, the creation of an observatory that pulls together understanding at a global level around political, economic, social, cultural learning that is a data repository and a learning opportunity. These signs and signals are likely to play out in extremely different ways in different contexts. And on the one hand, it may feel as if we're able to understand something that is happening now, but maybe the consequences of those things are likely to be completely different. So, for instance, in El Salvador, a lot of the narrative in the West over the last couple of months has been about how maybe this hasn't worked out, but actually I think it's very early days, and the possibility that maybe the implementation of Bitcoin has not achieved the things that were originally hoped for. It could lead to other kinds of outcomes that could change the country in different ways, and could have legislative outcomes. And so really there's an opportunity here to not only be making things now, but to be gathering and understanding and observing over time. And so to conclude, I think our hope is that there's a real opportunity here to bring together genuine long-term thinking that is not absorbed by the hype of the things that are happening in the market now, that are really about giving power to people in different ways, and offering different forms of organizing and governing. So these are our 4 hopes and recommendations, and I will leave that there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much to Rachel and to Anna from Careful Industries, who I'm sure you agree did manage to bring us back down to earth with some concrete recommendations of how we might make sense of everything as it emerges. I'm very, very pleased to welcome the rest of our panel to the stage. Is it a stage? Yes, the digital stage. So Rachel and Anna are going to be joined by Scott Smith from Changeist and Becky Faith from the Institute of Development Studies. And we're going to jump straight in. So Scott, As I've just said, you're joining us from Changeist, where you work to shape strategy through designs and prototyping. Welcome to the session. I'm going to kick off by quoting you in an article that you recently wrote in Stanford Social Innovation Review, which was titled Web3 and the Trap of For Good. In it, you say, if Web3 presents a chance to fix our collapses, it needs a value system that is integral, not optional. This means that social good must be integral not only to the ethos, but also the architecture and rule sets of any new web or technological paradigm. How might we go about creating that? And do the recommendations that Anna and Rachel have outlined in their paper and in their talk, do they resonate for you? What would you add? What would you take away?
Well, thanks very much for including me in the conversation. I would say, first off, if you're quoting an eloquent part of that article, it came from my co-author, Lena Srivastava, from Center for Transformational Change. And I think that she did a great job there of sort of summing up what we were trying to get at in the piece, which is this isn't new. You know, we've been in this kind of rodeo off and on now for the past 30 years. And there's a lot we can learn from past experiences with kind of new waves of technologies and new waves of sort of new models for technological engagement. And I think, we know, for example, that governance systems aren't baked into technology. They need to be brought to technologies. And so things like Web3 desperately need, a kind of governance framework that is bought into, agreed to by majority of the participants, most of the participants. We need ethical frameworks that are agreed, and I think Rachel just outlined in detail one sort of possible framework could be the possible framework. We need transparency and auditability. We need all of these kinds of things to be present that we've known help mitigate risk and improve the outcomes potentially with other technologies, provided the people who are driving and also engaged with them, and the communities who are being addressed by them can come to the table and be part of that conversation. The recommendations that were just kind of on the screen, I think, around sort of sandboxes, there's a model that we know works from prior waves and generations, that if you can have a test bed to find out where the sort of frictions are and where the difficult elements are, that's optimal. Again, standards work. We can't rush ahead of the standards. Otherwise, without kind of regulatory oversight and input, we end up in a situation like we have in real time right now with the FTX, crypto exchange going down the drain, and hurting a lot of people along the way. The models will be different in different places around the world, but we can't use populations as test beds. People can't afford to have more technology debt, more risk, more financial liability heaped on them in a lot of the communities that we're talking about in these conversations than they already have. They actually need less of all of those things. So I think these recommendations are a fantastic place to start, but we can go deeper.
Great, thank you. And I might just ask maybe Rachel or Scott, because it's come up a couple of times now, but the FTX Binance acquisition yesterday, obviously big news for anyone who's like a crypto nerd, but for those in attendance who aren't completely on top of the news, can you give us 30 seconds on what happened and why it's a big deal?
Rachel.
So FTX were one of the largest players in the crypto market, and over the last couple of years, the founder had bought out lots of other currencies that were having problems and sort of buoyed up the market. And then, due to some kind of technical oversight that I don't really understand, I have to say, it turned out they didn't really have any money at all. And they got bought out by the largest platform yesterday, which has led to lots of people's investments going right and down, because of course these are not regulated currencies. And I think one of the very interesting things here is that actually FTX is only, I think it was founded in 2019, and that in the market it is perceived to be one of the most stable, respected players, but that's only 3.5 years. And I think it really shows that taking a long-term perspective is very, very hard at the moment when we're in that kind of crazy hype.
Yes, when all things are relative and 3 years is stable and steady, it kind of says it all, doesn't it? Thank you for that brief news update. Did you want to come in, Rachel?
Well, I just see that Alexandra has clarified they haven't been brought out yet. They're waiting the final purchase.
The final due diligence. Thank you, Alexandra, in the chat. And that's actually a good prompt for me. If you're listening in, if you have questions for this fantastic panel, if you disagree, drop a comment in the chat. It's really nice to see such lively discussion taking place on YouTube. So share your thoughts with us. Right now, I'd like to turn to Becky Faith. Becky is joining us from the Institute of Development Studies. You've been working in this world of technology at the intersection of developing contexts for some time. In fact, for those who are tuning in, you might be interested to know that it was about 6 years ago now that Becky co-authored a paper called The 10 Frontier Technologies for International Development, which actually was the start of this entire program. So in a large part, Becky, if it wasn't for you, none of us would be here. So thank you, because that report led to the creation of the Frontier Tech Hub. So it would be great to get your thoughts. I mean, there are always evangelists and cynics when it comes to new technologies, right? And knowing the work that you do with FCDO and other NGOs and donors and foundations, what advice do you have for them? What approach should they be taking? Do you have any thoughts and guidance to offer those in attendance?
So thanks, Lea, and also just congratulations. I had a chance to read the reports, both your report and Rachel's report, and I thought really impressive pieces of work, partly in kind of clarifying lots of ethical issues and also explaining some really kind of dense and complex technologies. So this was a good opportunity to revisit the original 10 technologies for frontier development, which we did write 6 years ago, and kind of revisit some of the advice. And this is more of a plea, really, which you might expect from someone who leads a research cluster in one of the world's leading development studies institute, that to both kind of commission research and don't forget all the research that's been done in the past. So I'm just going to be sort of talking a bit about the frontier tech research that we did, and also talking about other FCDO funded research that we've carried out at IDS. So in the frontier tech report, the 10 technologies for international development, which is still available on the IDS website, one of the recommendations that we gave for development organizations was that we should promote that they should promote and advocate for improved conditions and frameworks for frontier innovation practices that promote safety and privacy, managing risks by using regulatory sandboxes, so you're 10 out of 10 on that, and overcoming obstacles that may limit frontier technologies' wider uptake and use. So I think it's really great that you got that kind of focus on the kind of incredible risks inherent in it. And also, I think it's worth reflecting on some of the research that was done as a kind of multi-million-pound program on technology and its role, the role that it played in transparency and accountability, that was funded by DFID, now FCDO. This is a program called Make Your Voices Count. And there's a wonderful kind of summary piece that was produced at the end of the Make Your Voices Count program that kind of summarizes the lessons on technology and accountability and governance. And they reflect that it was conceived in an era probably about kind of 8 to 10 years ago, where there was a lot of optimism about the role of technology in solving grand challenges and opening up government and kind of reconfiguring governance and all these sort of issues that sometimes Web3 has been kind of posited as a way of kind of fixing. But the kind of same messages that we always know about this relationship between technology and voice and development, that not all voices can be expressed through technologies, that whatever technology you're using needs to be adapted to a particular context, and also that transparency in information isn't enough to generate accountability and democracy. So I think sometimes when a new technology comes along, we can think, oh, we've got to kind of reinvent the wheel when it comes to these kind of foundational principles. And the other thing that I was thinking about is how does all this work relate to the principles for digital development? And I was assuming that FCDO, as DFID was, is a signatory to the principles of digital development, which are great, actually. I mean, I think they had some critiques when they came in, and they're kind of watered down and very general, but I think there's some really interesting points in there that we can kind of test Web3 against, which is use open source. And it's been interesting to see the kind of demise of Twitter, weeks a long time in social media, that everyone hasn't gone to a blockchain fired program. They've all gone to Mastodon, which is an open source platform. And another principle for digital development is built for sustainability. And whenever I have a conversation about blockchain in a development context, I can never get past, and I'm sure this has been a big issue in your conversations this week, the kind of sort of grotesque environmental impact of the amount of computing required for these technologies. And something in me, this is a kind of personal reflection, just can't get past that. How can it be good for development with the enormous amount of computing power that is required? And as an academic, I get to go off and schmooze through academic papers, and I've been reading a lot about kind of convivial technologies and how we might think about more kind of convivial approaches to using technologies, and reading one interesting paper about a matrix for kind of assessing appropriate convivial technologies, and they're factors that they're need driven, that they kind of fulfill basic needs, that they're interoperable, that they support and improve the environment. And I have to say that whenever I come across a Web3 technology, even in a development context where it's being used for social protection or for climate finance, I feel like it's not making the grade yet. And as someone who worked before my academic career in kind of open source advocacy, I worked for an NGO promoting open source tools. I feel that we've kind of, in our kind of rush to embrace Web3, we've forgotten the incredible potential of open source to contribute to development goals, and that it is just like the engine that's running a lot of the internet. I'll stop my ramblings now.
No, it's excellent, and thank you for, I think you said, mooching through the report so that you can share all of that with us. I think it's quite interesting now that you're basically talking about these really new and emerging technologies and all of these great foundations and frameworks that we already have that we can use to evaluate them and make progress against them. I think, just picking up one of the comments in the chat, and I will perhaps ask Rachel and Anna to comment on this first of all. Phil Outram, who's dialing in from Exeter, I believe, has said that, how do we tee? And there is this kind of, I think, tension between the caution and the ethics and the kind of frameworks that we're talking about here, and almost like the race for mind space and the other players who are incentivized to use Web3 for things like increased surveillance and control. So Phil has said that there is surely going to be big players like authoritarian governments who are incentivized in that way. And there will be a huge driving force but from them, and they will not play along with any of the rules that we've just mentioned. So a kind of interesting tension there. How would you respond, Rachel? How do we make sense of that race versus our own caution?
So, firstly, I would just like to say that Becky's points, I just agree with all of them. And I think many of them came up in previous drafts of a paper as we were kind of working our way through. And I think if we are going to try and be optimistic here, right, that the possibility of optimism is that actually there's a very different thing that this makes possible, which I guess I was trying to bring to life when I was talking, and I don't know if I really managed it. And the idea that we may be looking at different kinds of communities being created and lifted up, bottom up. And I think one of the things that we came to think is that the current technologies that we have now are only the way technology has chosen to express these ways of collaborating now, and that actually the technologies could look really different in 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years, and not to worry about that as much. More that there is an opportunity, if we're going to be really optimistic, for genuine bottom-up people-powered communities to be empowered to come together in different ways. And if we think about this in a kind of political way, maybe that's quite troubling. You know, maybe that means we could be looking at the end of nation states. I think that is not likely, but we'll certainly be looking at alternatives. And so I suppose, and I don't know if Anna wants to pick this up, the point of speculating in this way is not only to fixate on one negative outcome that might happen, but there are many, many possible things that could happen. And so while we're possibly looking at authoritarian top-down governance, we could equally, as an opposite force, be looking at many rising tides too.
Yeah, I would also agree with all of your points, Becky. And I think that all of those issues have come up through our research. And that in a way, like there were a number of issues that we identified through the research, like you mentioned about the environmental impact and the fact that, you know, Ethereum have moved from proof of work to proof of stake. But even so, proof of stake is problematic in many ways still, not just from an environmental perspective, but from who can stake effectively. Do you have a stake to put forward? So like those challenges could provide the environment to sandpit solutions and to accelerate solutions. And then if we decide that it's too problematic, then we can rule them out more quickly. But I think, you know, all of the solutions couldn't be provided through that methodology, but you could see some key challenges to work through.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you talk about that. Kind of slowing down to cautiously experiment might actually speed up the rate at which we disqualify things that aren't working as well. A couple of other great questions are coming through on the chat that I'd love to pick up on, and I might go next to Scott for this one. You know, a lot of the kind of discourse around the ills and the harms of Web2 are really about business models. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about ways that you see us being able to potentially monetize these new technologies, and whether we could, and I think this is another one from Phil, whether we could monetize the ethical improvements that we're hoping to bake into these new protocols. Do you think that there's an opportunity there for us to kind of have our cake and eat it?
No. I was thinking about this the other day, that, you know, sitting in an office in...
Sorry, Phil.
sitting in an office in New York about 30 years ago with my colleagues, we're trying to work out the earliest methods of measuring advertising on the web. And, you know, is it going to be CPM? Is it going to be some new model? And there was no conversation being had then of, you know, how do we do this safely? It was how which currency do we use to measure this in? And I think, you know, business models, you know, introduce economies, and economies are all, you know, are asymmetric. And often they have, you know, great sort of qualities, but they also, their value flowing from one place to another. And I think it's quite tricky to be thinking about sort of directly drawing a line of monetizing ethical improvements in the system. I think, you know, there are sort of probably more complicated ways of thinking about value and how it's distributed, and how it's used, and where incentives sit in the system. You know, it's often like when people ask people in my profession, and Rachel's as well, who work in kind of foresight and futures, you know, where's the money being made? And the answer is often, where's the money not being lost? You know, there's monetization in a way, and bad decisions not being taken, and leakages not happening, and harm not happening. And so I would tend to kind of start there first and make sure that we can think about looking at where these asymmetries happen of power and of flows of value before kind of jumping straight to tokenizing and trying to create, exchanges and transactions on these models. And that's difficult to do because it's inherently built around transactional technologies. And there's a great incentive there to use those, which is kind of where we've been so far, without the kind of guardrails to mitigate some of those issues.
Yeah. Sorry, bad news for you there, Phil, who I'm sure will respond in the chat with more comments. There's still a fair amount of chat on YouTube about this kind of tension of moving cautiously, and I guess others there eating our lunch. And Alexandra has said, my only concern with moving too cautiously is that other teams will move faster and overtake those slow moving teams. She's wondering whether instead there's a way to provide helpful tools to help fast moving teams to do this well. Rachel, what do you think? And are there tools at the ready that you would offer these fast moving teams?
So I'm going to yes and this, I think, in as much as if you look back over the last 20 years, something that I have learned through trying to work with business to make business more ethical is that it doesn't always work, and that actually there is an extent to which it is as important to model alternatives and to keep going, doing the hard work in creating the alternative and future and present, as it is to be mitigating and moderating those who are running ahead. If you look at, the thing that has happened with Twitter in the last week, we can see everyone has become too dependent on trying to make the privately owned company work, and actually we can be distributing our effort and doing other things. However, I would say again, if we look to the last 10 years, there's a lot I think we can learn from ethical AI and the teams who have been working both embedded in business and externally scrutinizing, and that really there is no what's the word, like the thing that has to happen is every product team, every business owner, everyone has to be responsible, and that actually creating a culture where ethical debt is not okay, I think, is the responsibility of every practitioner, every maker. And the concern that others will leap ahead, I think maybe they might end up just leaping off into the abyss, and that's okay. Let them, and we can try and create other ways of doing things instead.
So some really, really juicy concepts there about people like not leaping ahead, but leaping off an abyss, and this idea of a kind of ethical debt, which is really great and might actually be one of the tools that could help teams move forward. I'm curious, would Becky or Scott like to come in and contribute to this discussion about, what will happen? Will we be overtaken? Do you buy into this idea of leaping off into the abyss as Rachel has described?
I'm really torn because when we teach our development studies and our globalization business and policy students about digital platforms and about governance, we are very despairing about global sort of data governance, I have to say. We don't come up with any kind of like, wow, this could really be solved by blockchain. Although I think there's some really interesting emergent possibilities. But when it comes to kind of like trying to amplify kind of ethical application or kind of ensure that these technologies are used in an ethical way, I think there's something around procurement. There's something around kind of embedding social value in procurement. I've been talking to quite a lot of people. I do a lot of work on digital exclusion locally, and I've been talking to local authorities about their procurement processes and about how you can try and guarantee kind of social value and equity in your procurement processes. So there's something about the kind of purchases of technology and the purchases of digital systems requiring social value or requiring environmental audits and so on and so forth, and quality and impact assessments, because otherwise it is a kind of crazy free market of technology mania.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you're touching on procurement, and the initial report that you held up, the reason we're all here, you know, part of the recommendation was, you know, these technologies are happening, people are going to play with them, and part of your recommendation was to DFID at the time, you know, get involved. We heard from phase 3 at the start of the symposium that there is still a massive diversity issue in amongst all of this, despite the fact that it's 2022, there are relatively few women playing in the space. There are relatively few from other geographies outside of the Silicon Valley still. So Becky, you know, I'm wondering, like, is there a similar sense for you of this kind of inevitability of some of these things kind of happening, and that really part of how to make it better this time round is to make sure that a more diverse group of people are kind of in the mix, in the conversations, exploring as well?
I think that will definitely help. And I think the way that I think possibly like Rachel as well, I was working in the tech industry before the .com bubble burst in the late 90s, working on Britain's first ever online pizza delivery service.
Thank you on behalf of anyone who's ordered pizza in the UK.
and I think the tech sector has changed so much, and all those the conversations about diversity and the kind of actions about diversity, and we're now seeing a lot of like trade union organising in the tech sector, and that can only be a good thing. And I think development actors have really got a role to play. And I think, so again, sort of looking to the past, of looking to issues like calling on things like the digital principles, looking at the successes actually of open source. And I know I keep on kind of bleating on about open source, but it occurred to me when we were talking about kind of business models that people have made really good, like massive amounts of money out of open source technologies. And also just an awareness that things can change extremely fast, as we've seen. And I think it's really instructive to like take what's just happened with Twitter as an example of like these technologies aren't kind of fixed in stone, and that change can happen very fast, and that part of people leaving Twitter is about the lack of moderation, that they fear that the lack of that kind of influx of really offensive content. So yeah, I think I'm quite optimistic that increased diversity in the creation of tech and the decision making, but that diversity has to go all the way to the top. So when we've done research on, we were paid to do some research by the Gates Foundation on sort of diversity, gender diversity in open source for humanitarian projects, we could see that the diversity sort of stop short at the top. So you need that that really transformative commitment to kind of fund training, and that the change has to go all the way through the top. It can't just be like employing a few kind of sort of tokenistic women programmers here and there.
Yes, for sure. And a couple of comments coming through in the chat as well about diversity of different kinds, including neurodiversity, that will hopefully shape a kind of better Web3. There's so much vibrant discussion in the chat. I know the panelists are going to be responding to those comments directly. And of course, a little plug to stick around for after the discussions, and we can all chat face-to-face or face-to-face-ish on Microsoft Teams. I'd love to pick up a question by Tom Wilkinson around ICOs and operating tokens as potentially a quite elegant way for developers to earn a living from public good applications of Web3 without capturing a monopoly. Scott, I love the face that you're pulling as I say all of that. What do you think? Are ICOs an elegant way for developers to kind of take part in the spoils of the next stage of invention? Or are you less convinced?
I must have a really expressive face. Well, I'm just always curious where the rest of the question is going. I think it's, as I'm listening to these great responses and kind of really thoughtful, propositions that are being put out, I keep thinking about how, we don't have a responsibility to kind of hustle through particular, preset models of operating. There's a lot of pieces and parts to Web3. There's a lot of different elements that can be kind of disassembled, spread out on the kind of table in front of us, and think about carefully how different components can be potentially combined to enable something useful. The novelty aspect doesn't get you there. We have no responsibility for novelty. We have no responsibility to the future for pushing new technologies in, but we do have a responsibility perhaps to kind of create opportunity when it's there and when it's sensible. And I think, tokenization is kind of an underlying element of Web3 that can have some interesting uses if you're, kind of thinking carefully about the construction that it's kind of embedded in. There's a lot of ways to kind of use new economic models, I guess we could call them business models, for sort of thinking about how to compensate communities. But I think back around things like time banks and co-ops and all of these existing models that we have that you may be able to kind of replicate in this kind of environment, in a Web3 environment, that could be useful faster. I love the procurement example. It's an incredibly, can feel like a grinding topic, but when I think about having some kind of equalization between my own small organization, and I know Rachel and Anna's tried to work with big development entities and governments for which procurement systems are built for, or other kind of compensation or contracting systems are built for entities that aren't us. That kind of smoothing out would be tremendous.
Yeah.
I do always kind of have hold my breath for a second when it's connecting something like a coin offering, or a sort of heavily market driven mechanism like that directly to something that could be kind of sensitive.
Yeah, sure. So back again to procurement and maybe the kind of ease of doing business with smaller businesses and smaller entities. It yesterday, part of the conversation, I'm really struck by how some very, very old ideas are actually coming into their own almost through these technologies. And we heard from phase 3 in this idea of things like data unions and so it's like very, very old ideas, which we may have a resurgence as a result of this more decentralized, next wave. And we talked a lot about open source already. And Rachel, your comment in the chat has sparked me. We're talking about open source. Let's talk about digital commons. I'd love to hear how careful are kind of holding a view of digital commons in Web3, and maybe start with you, Anna.
Yeah, I think it's better to, as Scott was saying, to look to widen the conversation, to acknowledge that there's existing structures that we can look to and use and replicate, and tried and tested methods. I think the overall trends in all of our research point to the fact that there is a drive towards adoption of decentralized technologies, and Web3 is just one type of technology platform that people are going to and driving that change. But we mustn't forget the less technical techniques that people have been using for centuries that could work just as well. So I think it's about having that shared understanding of what will work best for people.
And
that's gone off on a tangent, but I'm going to pass to Rachel.
I'd add that I think one of the things we're seeing overall is that we can't really allow the technologies we're depending on for lots of things to be owned and governed only in the market, right? We need kind of genuine public infrastructure. We need things that everyone can influence and that we can depend on in the long term. And there's something really intriguing here about how we can collaborate to build infrastructures beyond the market, but whether a genuine approach to commoning is really about enabling, I think it's David Bollier who says a cornucopia of the commons, we don't need to think of the digital commons as a finite resource. We can have many, many, many commons interoperating and working together. And that feels to me, if there's anything genuinely exciting about Web 3, it's that it's nudging towards experimenting with that in DAOs. Maybe not there now, but that it's part of a movement pushing there overall.
Which kind of goes back to your point, Rachel, that actually this is just like a mood of the times, and the decentralized technologies are a kind of almost an artifact of the moment as opposed to a thing in their own right. And I see Becky nodding. Scott, does that resonate for you? Do you think people are kind of almost just a little bit fed up with the status quo, and that there's this kind of move towards a more decentralized, bottom-up, transparent everything? And that's what we're seeing here, not really about the technology at all?
Well, I think there's an element of that. There's an element of kind of the market needs to be fed, and it needs to be fed with a kind of cycle of new innovations that you know can spur development and pay people and create opportunity and investment and that kind of thing. I also think that, you know, when you think about how long the data conversation has been going on, the sort of data privacy, data surveillance, data commons. I was just thinking about, I'm in Barcelona, and the city here has, an interesting data commons model that was years in the making. These things don't happen overnight. And so I guess this, going back to the early part of the discussion, there's this sort of the tension of like, trying to put some speed bumps in a way to kind of, mitigate some of the risk from going headlong into technology with very little governance and oversight, but at the same time being patient about what could be developed, and how you could be both thoughtful and careful, but also, sensible about finding the right applications for things. And open source is a thing that's been around for decades, but has found certain applications. It also makes some companies a tremendous amount of money, being the kind of large entities that supply some of the needs of open source. So it's not a strictly, marketless mechanism.
It's I'm going to start wrapping up this panel by asking us to maybe each of you to complement some of this discussion about the speed bumps with, are there things to accelerate? I mean, the thing that I've definitely gotten out of these past few days is we need to accelerate the involvement of the kind of lesser heard voices and lesser kind of involved participants and stakeholders around what Dame Wendy Hall tomorrow starts to refer to as our digital planet, which I love. But if we're thinking about shaping a future in terms of brakes and accelerators, what should we be accelerating? Becky, let's start with you.
Something that we always push our students on to ask about technology is who benefits. Just ask that simple question: who asks for it and who benefits? And just asking those two conversations will get you a really long way. And I think there's something exciting. You're just talking about a kind of zeitgeisty moment about, actually there's a moment of kind of social dialogue about the technologies we want for the public square or for public conversations. And I think anything that contributes to the sense that a kind of anti the technological determinism of like, you just take what you're given, that encourages that kind of social dialogue is to be applauded and amplified.
I'll go next, talking about technological determinism. I think that solutions could be accelerated by flipping the challenge here, because we are talking about technology and then we're looking to find problems that it could address. And I think we should flip it around. And I think we shouldn't take such a technology-centric approach. I know from a policy-making perspective that's more challenging, but I think it could be beneficial to look at the challenges we want to address first, for the social, economic, environmental, and then see if there's any technology that might, or other solution, non-technological solution that might address those challenges.
Thank you, Anna. Scott, let's hear from you.
I've been thinking in recent days about sort of the power of, you know, big non-market institutions actually having a position, having you know, having their own needs and being able to kind of articulate them, becoming intimately familiar, for example, with UNDP's data strategy. And you know, this is it's a framework, it's a set of rules that say if we're going to deal with this, it has to fall within this framework. You know, we have to have use of open source. Data has to be managed a certain way. So being able to kind of proactively come to the table with the desires and kind of needs of stakeholders in mind, and say affirmatively what you do want and how it can be delivered and how you will operate, it really helps, rather than having to kind of be reactive and feeling like you're pressured by missing innovation that may be out there, but not really able to say why.
And finally, Rachel.
I mean, so I think the opportunity that we've had with the web for the last 30 years that we've maybe not capitalized on is it being about connecting us all and bringing us together. And I think if there's something I'd like to accelerate, it is the focus on, and I hate this is not the term I would like to use, but bottom up, not top down. Community first, not driven by markets or organizations or people who sit around big tables, but actually just a more adaptive network that sort of mirrors the world around us more. And I think there's a huge opportunity there, but we're unlikely to make money out of it, so maybe it's harder to achieve.
Thank you all so much. We haven't even done, I don't think, maybe 10% of the comments and the questions that have come through on YouTube Live. So if you're watching and you feel unsatisfied and there's still so much more going on for you, things you agree with, things you don't agree with, Abby will whiz you along to the Teams chat in just a moment. But I think that there's a lot that I'm taking out of this conversation, and I feel like I've learned so much from all of you in the last 40 minutes alone. Becky, thank you for the questions. Ask who will benefit from this technology. Anna, look at the challenges first, start with the problem, not the technology. Scott, look at the non-market institutions and their involvement in our civic web. And though she hates it, Rachel, thank you. Bottom up, involve those who don't usually sit at big tables and make important decisions. I'm sure I speak for everyone who's tuned in when I say thank you all so much for your time and your wisdom and your energy. And I hope you're able to hang out with us a little bit in the Teams link, which will follow shortly. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Abby.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you to all of our panelists. So we're going to wrap up in a moment, and before we do, I'll just say a little trailer for tomorrow. It's been so great to see many of you joining for part 1, part 2, and today's part 3. Part 4 tomorrow is the final of our 4-part series, and we're going to be asking the question, so what now? So for those who aren't joining the Teams conversation that we will talk a little bit more about in a moment, we'll see you tomorrow at 1 p.m. GMT, where we'll be hearing from 6 speakers on what we should do next. We'll be thinking through the risks. We'll hear insights into how governments need to understand the constantly changing landscape of standards in the crypto space. And standards came up quite a bit today, so it would be great to continue that conversation. We'll be hearing more about opportunities like data self-sovereignty from the UK's digital catapult, or a real-life story of how students are already being trained in Calabar, Nigeria, on migrating Web 2 apps into Web 3. We'll be talking about ethical issues as well, and we'll be hearing from Professor and Director of the Centre for the Decentralised Digital Economy, who'll share some provocations on identity, on fake news, on misinformation, and whether decentralised tech holds potential solutions for those at all. And we're honoured that tomorrow our closing discussion is with Dame Wendy Hall, Regis Professor of Computer Science at the University of Southampton and author of 4 Internets, Data, Geopolitics and the Governance of Cyberspace. So that's a short trailer for tomorrow. And I think, Lee, we're almost ready, aren't we, to head into the Teams chat. So If this was in person, we'd be gathering over a coffee now to meet, to chat, to swap views, to disagree maybe, or agree with everything we've heard today. There's been some great chat happening in the comments, so I can see there are still some questions that are remain unanswered. So the link will be coming at you shortly in the chat. We'll be heading over to Teams and we'll continue that room for about 30 minutes now. So do come along. We've had one at the end of each session yesterday and the day before, and it's been a very lively and far-reaching discussion.
Thanks to everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you in the chat or tomorrow or both.